Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, Adam Tooze, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about the economics of coffee. Coffee prices are at an all-time high, so we'll try to unpack why that's the case, what that means. But first, we wanted to give you another data point. That is $5.5 trillion. That is the volume of payments coming in the form of 1.4 billion individual payments that are made every year through the U.S. government's secure payment system. That's a system that's run by the Treasury Department's Bureau of the Fiscal Service. It's a sleepy office in the Treasury Department, normally sleepy, not a bureau that otherwise most people have heard of, but right now it's at the center of the news, with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency having gained access to that system.
Musk tweeted, "The DOGE team discovered, among other things, that payment approval officers at Treasury were instructed always to approve payments, even to known fraudulent or terrorist groups. They literally never denied a payment in their entire career, not even once. His vow to cut government spending has plenty of support from the president."
He's got access only to letting people go that he thinks are no good if we agree with him, and it's only if we agree with him. He's a very talented guy from the standpoint of management and costs.
5 former Treasury secretaries are now speaking out together against President Trump's move to overhaul the government and slash the size of the workforce, including Elon Musk and his DOGE team moving to access a sensitive Treasury Department payment system that's typically handled by non-political career civil servants. The secretary's writing...
The court system have put a halt, at least temporarily, to Elon Musk's team's accessing this system, but the very fact that Musk's Department of Government Efficiency gained that access in the first place has set off alarm bells in certain parts of the financial community. Fears that a catastrophe could be in the making as a result of something potentially going wrong here. So we thought we'd try to take a closer look at what this payment system is, what it does, what it means for the U.S. and the rest of the world. So Adam, to start off with, could you offer a basic description of what this U.S. Treasury payment system is, what it does? I mean, as I understand, it's the system that conducts most of the government's transactions, payments to entitlement recipients, Social Security recipients, but also, grantees receive their payments through this system, but even bond payments for people who hold U.S. government debt, they're also paid through this system. What is the scope of what this system does, and what does it do exactly?
Yep, payments and payment systems are a little bit of an obsession of the current moment. They're very undramatic in many ways, but if you think about, the Elon Musk mafia, they will come out of PayPal, which is a means of making payments. Crypto is a means of making payments. So these kind of modern fintech preoccupations all center around the essentially mundane activity of payment, and as part of an exchange, or in the case of a large organization like the US government, perhaps the largest organization in the world, they have to have an organized mechanism for organizing the flow of money through the system and then out to recipients. Every big organization anyone listening to this podcast will ever have dealt with has one of these systems. Foreign policy is trying to get me to sign up for one at this very moment. It's that moment when you're asked to go away and do training on the vendor system or whatever it's called. That's the payment system. So basically, it's just a organized, electronically based, in this case since the late 50s, early 60s, programmable software-based system for organizing the regular payments to everyone that receives checks or deposits from the United States government. So that does include the full gamut from grant funding to states and local governments, which goes through a thing called the Automated Standard Application for Payments, or ASAP, or the payment automation manager, which is used to make payments for Social Security, for instance. And the whole thing is organized under the remit of the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. The volumes here are gigantic, 5.4 trillion in fiscal year 2023, 1.3 billion payments. The volume on any given day can easily touch a couple of $100 billion. It's a gigantic part of the metabolism of American economy, American society, of American government. The BFS itself, the Bureau of Fiscal Services, administers a system that it doesn't in any really very meaningful sense control, right? So the system operates and is triggered by a thing called the payment file. The payment file is sent to the BFS by an agency that's employing its services. This is a government agency, so that payment file will include the recipient's banking information, social security number to identify that person, and then BFS processes the payment as per the instruction, and all it, under normal circumstances, ever does, and the only thing it's set up to do systematically, is to check that payment against a short list of lists. So there are a small number of lists that payment has to be checked against automatically. They're basically do not pay lists, and they include things like the death master file, which is social security numbers which may still be circling around. This is the number every individual in the US has that actually belongs to a deceased person, so you prevent the embarrassment of paying somebody who's dead. But it could also include something much more highbrow and high political, like a foreign national flag by the Office of Foreign Asset Control. These are people that run sanctions. Or it could be just somebody who owes a lot of money to the federal government in the form of debt. And obviously, you don't want to be paying out to them. The whole thing is processed electronically. Some people will receive electronic deposits, and other people, this is the US, will receive paper checks. And that's the way this system operates. It's essentially an organic part of any large, complex organization, not that different from the corporate world, just very, very large in this case.
So the way you're describing it, it sounds like the system is essentially something technical rather than political. And yet, making payments or giving people money, some people money rather than others, I guess, could be seen as a political decision. So yeah, why is this system properly considered to be technical? I mean, should this be the choke point at which payments are evaluated as authorized and legitimate? And if not here, then where should that consideration be happening?
So, it's part of the Treasury bureaucracy and therefore part of the state, and therefore you could say inherently political. And if you are a libertarian, an anarcho-libertarian, then you might believe that we shouldn't have this at all. And so just presuming its existence is in and of itself a political position. Or you could, if you were just a privatizer, you could say, well, why does the government do this? And why isn't this outsourced to a private agency, right? So you could say at that level, it's political. But of course, it isn't the people operating that system that make the choice that it should happen in the Treasury. That's a decision made somewhere else. It's a constitutional decision that we think that certain functions ought to be performed by government bureaucracies. And to a certain extent, the state exists. It's large. It needs to make payments. So we need to have a payment system, right? Broadly speaking, I would defend this, because this definition and this sense of it is technical, because what does politics mean? If politics is about making complex choices, or it's about fundamental questions of ideology, or the definition of friends and enemies, or the constitution of majorities so as to enable political action, this isn't any of those things, and that isn't what's happening there. There could be micropolitics in this organization. Do you employ women? Is it a segregated organization? How do you think about, which computers do you buy? Do you have a policy of protecting it against, Chinese influence, for instance? In that way, this technical apparatus could have a political aspect, but the machine itself, in its inherent purpose of just distributing grants or distributing money, doesn't seem to me to qualify. And one of the fundamental misunderstandings of the Musk people, and perhaps also the Trump people, is that this applies to the payments themselves, right? So the decisions about whether or not to make the payment are not made by the BFS. They're made by the other federal agencies that send it the payee file. Once it's got that file, it just cranks through. It doesn't make any choices about those files other than, is the payee on a don't pay list, right? And that's a mechanical operation in its own right. From somewhere else, they get another list, and so they get an instruction to pay, and they get a list, and they check one against the other. And if you red flag on the don't pay list, then the payment doesn't go through. What Musk and co. appear to believe is that by taking charge of this plumbing, they can somehow directly intrude and at that point begin to make judgments about who gets paid and who doesn't. And that's a misunderstanding of the organization and the legal structure of this entity. And it will be a corruption of this entity. And it's not even obvious whether you can technically set it up to do this, because you would then need to manipulate the don't pay lists, presumably. And those may not be open to change by this agency. This would be, this is above or below my pay grade in terms of figuring out what's going on there. And most fundamentally, what the Trump administration as a whole doesn't really fully or wants to test is this question of whether they have the right to stop paying funds which were approved and authorized by Congress. And this is this issue of impoundment. And broadly speaking, I think the constitutional jurisprudence on this is absolutely clear, which is that they don't. So congressional payments are, broadly speaking, defined as a certain amount of money to be paid for a certain purpose to a certain group of people. And you don't have any discretion over whether you do that, or they're defined by a formula. And again, you don't have any discretion over whether you make that payment or not. So the idea that you can just, as an act of fiat by government, choose to stop paying because you disagree with the politics or some buzzwords trigger you or whatever, it's very unlikely to stand up in law. They may want to, as it were, force the issue and see how far they can go, but that's the process they're engaged in. And you wouldn't need the BFS system. In fact, the BFS system's kind of secondary to that. So because that's simply the mechanical mechanism through which you either do or you don't pay. So there's a struggle going on here. It's very multifaceted. It's obviously profoundly disconcerting that Musk and his bros somehow got into this system. They insist it was mainly read-only. There was clearly a moment when somebody was given write privileges as well, so as to be able to change the system. It's not clear how much they changed, whether they even understood exactly how much they'd been empowered. But right now, anyway, the status quo seems to be that we're back to read-only, if at all. And I think we probably, hopefully, fingers crossed, can pull back from this technical level and actually focus on the politics, which will require more congressional work than the Trump administration appears so far to believe. But that will depend on the courts and their willingness to actually follow the instructions of the courts.
Yeah, it does seem like that may be part of the thought of Musk and his team, is that by changing this machine in some ways, that it can be made to do other things beyond this sort of technical remit, getting into the level of the code and actually altering it in a way maybe that would allow for it to be more overtly political. But I guess that for me raises the question of, how complex is the structure of this payment system that we're talking about? And relatedly, how fragile is it? Could it break? And then what happens if this system, again, the volume of payments, $5.5 trillion, what happens if it goes down? Are there alternative ways of routing money to where it needs to go from the U.S. government's perspective?
So, I think the crucial question with this system appears to be how old it is and what vintage of software does it belong to. It's that kind of old, and it really is an early vintage. It's either the very first generation of software, of languages, or, perhaps one step on from the very first generation. So it's written in COBOL, which is a computer language that was developed at the behest of the Department of Defense, starting on a kind of crash program in 1959. And you can see how originary it is from the fact that at the time, the DOD had 225 computers total, and 175 more on order. And they were a bit freaked out by the fact they'd spent $200 million programming this handful, it's not a handful, but a couple of hundred computers. And so they turned to the emerging software computer programming community and said, can we make a language that would enable us potentially to get some degree of portability between the different systems? And what they appear to have hit on is, the idea of modifying one of the very, very early programming languages, which was Flowmatic, which was invented by Grace Hopper, and developing that into what then became one of the first widely used programming languages. And it was from the very beginning a programming language with a particular purpose. This is one of the distinctive things about this early generation of programming languages. COBOL stands for Common Business Orientated Language. And large applications continued to be written in this language all the way down to our era, 2006. So it was an enduring and very long-standing investment, very, very many large organizations. I'm no computer science expert, but I, like you, Cam, had some exposure to coding, as we would now call it, computer programming in the 70s and 80s. And what I gather from reading about COBOL is that on the one hand, it's attractive because it uses quite a lot of conventional English terms. But on the other hand, it's not well structured in the modern sense of a computer language, right? So there's an understanding now of computer languages as breaking down into a series of absolutely fundamental elements, which all well-formed computer languages should be structured around. And COBOL isn't well suited to the organization of very large software applications along these lines. And the consequence is, to quote one commentary, is that its programs are monolithic. They're hard to comprehend as a whole, despite their local readability. So at any given stage, you're reading along and you're understanding, because it's using conventional English, what it's instructing you to do. But because it's not, maybe in colloquial language, one might say modular, it's quite difficult to get a feel for the overall arc of the project. So it's a bit like saying you speak English and then being confronted with War and Peace in translation with no chapter headings. So you just have this sprawling, massive epic that you do understand word by word and has been translated for you into English, so you understand it word by word, but you don't really have a way of grasping the whole thing. There's no table of contents. It's not clear how one bit of the program attaches to other bits of the program. And when you build very, very large applications, very large pieces of code in this way, they then take on a kind of, people refer to the big COBOL systems in the Treasury as dialects. One bit of the system will function in one way, another bit of the system will function in another way. And there are 30 separate large COBOL systems in the Treasury, or have been in the past, which the current crop of software engineers have tried to structure and organize within the Treasury. So the Payments Application Modernization, PAM, was an effort to sort of bring these organically grown COBOL systems, which go back decades, into the modern era and to unify them within a system that is more like modern software. And I think there are just very large open questions about whether anyone who isn't from within that culture of progressively developing these massively complex, poorly structured systems can safely make what appear to be small changes and have any real reason for thinking that they know what will happen next. And I think that's the real anxiety here. These are large, complex, opaque, sprawling, antiquated systems that experts, and that means not just technical experts, but people who have history with this system, can be trusted to run and make work. And a bunch of, newbies coming in and just thinking they're smart and they can fix this are almost doomed to failure. And knowing that, to answer your bigger counterfactual question, I mean, sure, you could set up a new and better payment system for the US government. It's true of almost all the software systems the US government operates. But could you do that in the kind of time and pace that we need when people's lives depend, their livelihoods depend on the continuity of payments, and those need to be absolutely regular? No, the short answer is you can't. That would require a huge investment of software expertise. It's not available, and no one who's ever lived through a large-scale software upgrade in even a medium-sized organization will be under any illusions about how smoothly this would go when we're dealing with one of the largest and most important systems in the world, dealing with, $4 trillion, the US GDP is 25. That's 20 to 25% of GDP flowing through this system. You do not want even a minutes, a seconds delay in any of those payments.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to even imagine. I mean, it's on one hand, if recipients of Social Security miss payments as a result of some problem with the system, that's horrible enough. But then I'm trying to contemplate if, holders of U.S. bonds don't get payments. I mean, is there a potential for a kind of global financial crisis? Will financial markets be understanding if something goes wrong with this payment system?
I mean, so far what we've seen, there have been threats of technical default in the past over debt ceiling standoffs in Congress. The Treasury market has hitherto reacted relatively coolly to this kind of alarmism because, fundamentally there is a belief that it's just too important to break. Surely they wouldn't. And I think the Trump administration in its current militant form in this early phase of, what one really is attempted to call the seizure of power, they may be testing the limits of that, but we haven't seen a disaster in the Treasury market yet at all. So I would potentially, absolutely, that is one of the nightmare scenarios. Those are the two nightmare scenarios, right? There are three. USAID was the first, which is the cutoff of US support to some of the most desperate people in the world. The second would clearly be a massive disruption of the American social system as a result of the failure to pay basic pensions, social security, these kind of things. And the third would be, yes, ructions in big financial markets.
Yeah, in my own reading about this system, I've repeatedly come across descriptions of this system as the heart of the U.S. government, almost the kind of like the main artery of the government as a whole, to kind of describe the stakes of Elon Musk accessing it. And this got me wondering about, as you started out describing, the status of payments in general. And I realize this is a kind of much more general question than some of what we were just discussing, but what is the government aside from this series of payments that funnel through this system? I mean, is there a U.S. government at all aside from this movement of money that this system represents? I mean, what is the kind of, to use a philosophical term, what is the ontological status of payments when it comes to government?
Well, I think there's an obvious fascination. Well, at least in the current generation, there's an absolute fascination with what is sometimes referred to as plumbing issues, right? I come out of, kind of a critical macro finance tradition, or at least for a while, this was a powerful tradition that was very focused on these issues of payments and of plumbing. And there's a lot to be learned about how power operates at that level. I think there's also, however, a bit of a fallacy in believing that because it's essential and elemental, it therefore is, in some senses, there you can read the true heart of the system, right? This I would call of the kind of, I think in Greek literary theory, it's synecdoche, right? It's this idea that in the particular small part, you can see the whole. It might be true. It would be kind of nice if it was true. I actually think it's, generally speaking, not true. So I kind of I have had some rather highbrow conversations with Marxists recently in which I've insisted on some sort of plural ontology so that you can't get to the whole from the individual minute part, right? That doesn't work. Nor will one whole or one single thing stand in. So right now, my mood would be to say, well, yes, it's difficult to imagine government without payments, but that's not what government is, right? It's collective will formation, it's laws, it's technical functions, sure, but it's also coercion. Clearly, it's true that not a lot of government functions without payments. But let's just spin out that fantasy and imagine what it would work. You could notionally organize everything through force, which would mean you didn't have to pay for anything. But then, of course, the question would be, what about those exercising the force? The famous last words of any regime are presumably, well, the soldiers hadn't been paid for a couple of months. You don't want to be there. The soldiers haven't been paid for a couple of months. Or, policemen's wages hadn't been adjusted for inflation. That's bad news when you're in that situation from the point of view of the holder of power, because if you're going to claim that beyond payments there is also violence, the real question is what motivates coercion and violence, right? How do you organize that monopoly of legitimate violence, which Weber will say is definitional of the state? There is one scenario in which it would be safe not to pay the soldiers or the policemen, and that would be one in which there was no money economy. So this would be like the Russian Civil war economy of the war communism of the early 20s, in which case the violence by itself would secure the livelihoods of those men with guns, right? So this would be really degree zero of economic activity, in which basically what we're saying is we will pillage what we need to survive. And the consequences of that you would expect in the short term, in fact, would be a spiraling down of the economy into disaster. If that is all you're relying on, if that is all a state is relying on, it's a nightmare. Anarchists will, of course, imagine a world in which you don't need that kind of force. But then the question is, how do you, on a large scale, in a complex division of labor, orchestrate the exchanges that would be necessary? How do you build that agreement? And it would then require you to mobilize politics. But then the question, I think, from the money side would be, well, what is the medium within which you express your agreement to allocate resources in a certain way? And one of my great friends, Stefan Eich, like in his work on Aristotle and money, explains that one of the principal functions of money as a unit of account is also inherently political, in that it's the medium within which we express the consequences of our political agreement to divvy the cake up a certain way. To make that claim, you have to know what the cake is, you have to define the cake. And how do we measure the cake? Well, we measure it in money. And so money is doing this primal job of providing us with the medium within which we say this is how the cake's going to be divided. So you end up, I think, if you strain to imagine the state without money, without payments, I think one does strain. At some level, they're essential to the state and yet not sufficient to describe the state. It's conversely also clearly true that it's very difficult to imagine money without the state. And this is perhaps the deepest, perhaps the contempt that people like Musk show for this piece of Treasury wiring, the Bureau of Fiscal Service, express ultimately their ridiculous crypto fintech imagining that somehow one could have money without the state. And de facto, what they're trying to tear apart is what is a profoundly organic linkage between state power and payments, the receipts, of course. I mean, classically, money is brought into existence through taxes, not through payments, but the two are very deeply and organically linked. And that may be what's at work here, that they just think you can go into this and monkey around with it and just set a bunch of switches and then implement your anti-woke ideology and nothing else will happen, right? I don't, to be honest, know what motivates them. But if one were to guess, that might be part of it, their refusal to really grapple at this level with how profoundly imbricated these systems are and how inextricably interlinked they are, and how no amount of silly libertarian utopian fantasizing is going to be able to untangle them without just unimaginably and unfathomably spectacular catastrophic consequences. And that's, that may be the edge of what they're exploring, but hopefully the checks and balances operate, and this goes away as an issue.
Yeah, we will see. I'm sure learn more about what happens once the courts decide if Elon Musk's team can maintain their access to this payment system or not. But for now, we will take a break, and we will be back after that to talk about coffee. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is $3.84. That is the current price per pound of Arabica coffee beans. That is a record high price. Coffee prices of all kinds are hitting record levels around the world. So we thought we'd try to discuss the economics of coffee. Who doesn't like coffee? I certainly do. So we thought we'd try to unpack what is going on with coffee. To start off with, Adam, I thought I'd ask about the history of coffee as a global commodity. What qualifies it as a global commodity to begin with? I thought this could be a kind of lens through which to kind of discuss what a commodity is, as opposed to other commercial product. So yeah, what makes coffee a commodity in the first place?
So it's a really interesting question. I mean, a commodity, generally speaking, in regular parlance, is any good that's bought and sold that is used to manufacture other goods. So they're inputs in the production of other goods and services, rather than finished goods sold to consumers, notably those under a brand name. So commodity also implies interchangeability. You don't care about the specific delivery you're getting. You're just buying, so and so many tons of X product. It's a kind of fluid, because as soon as you start actually grading, when we talk about the oil market as the most gigantic commodity, all the oil specialists will tell you that actually Venezuelan oil is completely different from Texas, which is completely different from Brent or C. But each one of those then is a commodity that's traded, and you don't need to inquire into the specific drilling platform it's come from. So oil's a commodity: coal, iron ore, coffee, cocoa, wheat, but also certain generic memory chips, as opposed to NVIDIA high-end AI chips, right? Where the particular chip and the particular manufacturer matter. So that's what commodities are. And in the history of social criticism, say in Marx, like Capital, for instance, Capital starts with a discussion of the commodity and the commodity form, because for him, it's the core of what it means for something to move from being something valued for its inherent properties and its use value to something that's valued simply because of its market value. And how does that happen? And what is the mystery behind this process? Historically speaking, for coffee, we think it was first used, this is according to legend, by a goat herder in Ethiopia that discovered coffee's energizing effect. Sufi monks in Yemen used it. It's coming out of the Horn of Africa, basically. Became a staple in Yemen and other parts of the Middle East, and then spread to the Ottoman Empire, and from there to early modern Europe. It was controversial initially. The Catholic Church had to have a big debate about it in the late 1500s, and Pope Clement VII, in fact, ruled on the permissibility of coffee, which is why certain Christian sects, like the Church of Jesus and Christ and the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, abstain from drinking coffee because they think it's a stimulant that, is impermissible. By the 17th century, it's reached Italy, North Africa, the Middle East, India, the East Indies, Western Europe. Coffee houses begun to open in London in the 1650s. The first one is Pasco Rosie's Head, which opened in 1652. This was a Greek servant of a Turkish coffee importer that set up the first coffee house. It reaches the Americas in the 1800s. And this is the consumption side. And the other side of a commodity is also bulk production. And part of that is driven by the story of the outward spread of coffee production from the Horn of Africa, East Africa, to Java in the 1690s by the Dutch colonists, to Martinique, Saint-Domingue by the French, and then crucially Brazil, which by the 1840s, 1850s is the largest coffee producer in the world, accounting for about 40% of production. And that's possible because of the coffee industry's reliance on slavery, on chattel slavery. So by the first half of the 19th century, about 1.5 million slaves are involved in Brazilian coffee production. When the foreign slave trade is outlawed, the Brazilian plantations go on using slave labor from domestic populations until slavery is finally abolished in Brazil, which is really late 1888. Today, still, Brazil is the dominant producer, 37%. And then next, it's kind of fascinating. You might think Colombia, maybe Indonesian, Ethiopian, if you're thinking history. But no, Vietnam is the second largest global producer, accounting for 17%. Colombia and Indonesia, 7-8% each. And Ethiopia, the original home of coffee, is only 4%. And that's actually a big issue right now with the European Union, because coffee is a small-scale peasant production in Ethiopia, and the European Union is imposing these land use rules. And we maybe should come back to Ethiopia and do an episode about it, because it's a very interesting economy.
Yeah, I'm curious how this market works and how prices ultimately get set in this market for coffee. And I'm thinking specifically of major coffee purchasers, like Starbucks is the one that comes to mind. How do they interact with this commodity market? And does Starbucks gain leverage over its suppliers in some way? Do they play suppliers off one another to kind of manipulate this commodity market somehow?
So like cocoa, not quite as extreme as cocoa, but like cocoa, the coffee market is something that people all over the world regularly consume, and it comes from, in many cases, small peasant production. So Starbucks buys coffee from 400,000 farmers in more than 30 countries. So there is a huge inequality in size, corporate power, and so on between Starbucks and the people that supply it. And so fair trade coffee, all these kind of things are worth, if you're concerned about global equity, they are definitely worth, like the same with cocoa and chocolate. This is something where, consumer choices in the rich markets can make a difference on a small scale, of course, to individual farmers and individual buyers. But the thing about the coffee market, unlike the cocoa market, is that buying is relatively dispersed. So Starbucks, which is the biggest buyer of coffee worldwide, buys only 3% of the global turnover of coffee. And so if you read about Starbucks operations, it sounds like a company which is basically, it's more like a big financial market. So Starbucks has to hedge itself against the risk of large fluctuations in the global coffee price. So that price you started by quoting is a huge challenge for Starbucks. And it's very interesting to see how they do this. For a long time, they were relying on fixed price contracts, which is a way of securing yourself against the future. Of course, the risk is the price falls and then you're paying over the odds. But if you go for long-term fixed price contracts and the price moves, you basically have to post collateral because you are exposed to a risk. And the banks which allow you to engage in the forward transaction want to know that you can cover the risk. And that then becomes expensive in its own right. And Starbucks right now is reducing its hedging program and being willing, therefore, to take more risk on this market. All of this is not, the talk of a massive monopolist. This is a very large, very sophisticated company. But in relation to the market for coffee, not the dominant. It's not the single dominant player. It's having to hedge itself against risk. And so what Starbucks does increasingly on a large scale is actually hold stores of physical coffee. So rather than doing it by way of contracts, they hold about $920 million worth of green and roasted coffee ready to go as a buffer against spot market volatility. But farmers right now are actually getting this is an instance where the news that you're quoting is good news for coffee farmers all over the world. The problem is in the small traders in between. So you've got a coffee farmer, you've got an exporter, you've got a big buyer. And the exporter is caught in between with Starbucks trying to demand a fixed price and the farmers driving prices up. And the coffee exporters in between are in some have been under huge pressure because they have to raise debt to pay the farmers, and they're not always able to get that back when they sell into the market. So it's a market undergoing major pressure, and the biggest player in it accounts for 3% of it. So it's the cocoa supply chain is much more dominated by a cluster of very, very big buyers, very, very big intermediaries.
Yeah, I did not know that Starbucks literally owns $1 billion worth
of green coffee,
of coffee as a kind of strategic
reserve. So they can keep going for a while without being exposed to these market shocks. All of that is telling you that they can't control the price itself. Because holding the coffee is expensive, right? Because you haven't sold it to anyone yet. So basically you're rolling that over in debt. You're holding $1 billion worth of debt and paying interest on that so as to be secured against price fluctuation.
So you mentioned the role of colonialism in establishing the coffee trade around the world in the first place. I'm curious how that history of colonialism is still legible in today's coffee trade, or to the extent that it is at all.
Yeah, so the entire world economy is still, to a very considerable extent, a mirror of the colonial era, right? The richest countries in the world are themselves imperial players, and the poorest countries are the victims of colonial politics. And that's a given. But it's very striking. For some commodities, those effects have leveled out. So if you are cell phones, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa has very, very complete cell phone coverage now, even though, it's home to by far and away the most poor people in the world, and has not found the place in the global division of labor it needs. I'm obsessed with Sub-Saharan Africa's future right now. Next year, the share of working age population, the total number of working age Sub-Saharan Africans will exceed that of the entire working age population of the developed world. This is like the big drama. And in certain areas, limited areas of technology, they are, at the races, but in other respects, in terms of basic capital equipment, not, and also with regard to different types of consumption, not. And so this is where you really see the legacies of colonialism still inscribed. I think you'd have to say with coffee, it's mainly cultural patterns. So there's incredibly high coffee consumption, especially in Northern Europe. I mean, it's really bonkers numbers. Like Finland has the world record of 26 pounds of coffee per head per year. That's half a pound of coffee per person per week. I mean, it's really insane. They must just drink, just continuously. Brazil is in 14th place with 13 pounds per head. The US actually is a relatively modest 25th with 9 pounds. But where the frontier of coffee expansion is, and it's been, global business pages news, is China, where coffee cafe has become like, a status symbol for young Chinese. Bubble tea as well, but coffee is the like cutting edge of Western style consumption. And that's, a giant market because currently Chinese consume about half a pound of coffee per capita. In the big cities, it's way more than that, but that's across the whole country. And so, if you're in the coffee business, seeing whether you can break into that market is a gigantic possibility. And so there have been really large scale mobilizations of capital in the hope of building a Starbucks for China. Starbucks is in China, but building a coffee chain with that kind of penetration, Luckin and people like that. I enjoyed some really bizarre Chinese coffee cocktails this summer.
Yeah, I mean, I guess then to focus on the West, I'd love to talk about the role that coffee has played in the development of the, political and economic system of the West. I'm thinking here specifically of the early writings of the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. He talked about how coffee is deeply linked to the rise of political liberalism in the first place, via coffee houses as places where people in the 18th century, 19th century began meeting and talking about politics. And the fact that civil society requires gathering spaces is, pretty obvious. How could you have democracy without kind of exchanges of ideas? But what specific role does coffee play in that story?
Yeah, this is Habermas's classic second dissertation, Habil, the structural transformation of the public sphere. And though I think you're absolutely right that it is obvious that the public sphere requires a physical manifestation, and it clearly did in the polis in ancient Greece. For Habermas, it was actually rather an important kind of expansion of the Marxist argument, because he wanted to show, if you like, that modern development, capitalist development, made promises to democratic open discourse that it fails to deliver on. And that had to be a kind of materialist argument. And so his argument was that early modern capitalism, through this trade in coffee, opened up these spaces of discourse, the coffee houses that were spreading in London, as we were saying, from the middle of the 17th century. And these become places of meeting and conversation, crucially because they're not alcohol fueled, right? So they're places that you can go and drink a cup of something stimulating, but not get drunk. They're also places because they're new. Alcohol is, of course, a long history of stimulant in European culture and elsewhere as well. These are new innovations, new places of meeting. And so there was also aristocratic mingling with the new commercial bourgeoisie. And this, for Habermas, is what makes them so central. And, it was recognized at the time. I mean, by the first decade of the 18th century, with 3,000 coffee houses opened across Britain. And the British government was very concerned about this. And in 1675, Charles II, the restored dynast after the English Revolution, had beheaded his father. When he comes back to London, one of the things he does is to issue an edict against, dissenting talk in coffee houses. And not without reason. In the clash between London, between Britain and its colonists in North America 100 years later, the coffee house again plays an absolutely crucial role. I mean, folks will know, of course, that tea and the taxation on tea became one of the key issues driving the rage of the colonists in New England against London. And as a result, the Continental Congress declared coffee America's national drink to protest the British taxation. And in Philadelphia, in Boston, and in Williamsburg, coffee houses were centers of political ferment in the United States as well in the 18th century. That's a role they also played in the French Revolution a couple of decades later. And the colonial history of the United States and its revolutionary history is also directly tied up with coffee. So in that history of the liberal revolution, so-called, of the early modern and 18th century, coffee plays a very important role.
Then I'm curious if we could turn that analysis around a bit, because I think it's a compelling case that the kind of stimulant effects of coffee had a productive role in the development of liberalism and democratic discourse. But could we also think of those stimulant effects as an expression of what another social theorist, say Michel Foucault, called biopower? It's an idea that's distinctly more repressive in a way. And I'm thinking here of the way, the appeal of coffee is clearly this stimulant effect. And is that maybe inextricable also from productivity in a capitalist sense, from the way we all work in a capitalist society and the way we all use coffee to fuel our work? Is that the flip side of the kind of Habermasian analysis we just talked about in terms of coffee fueling democracy and liberalism?
I mean, I always think of this not when I see coffee advertised, but Sudafed-based, cold medication in the US is commonly advertised on television as enabling you to push through the cold. As a good European, you think, no, stay at home and take a cure, like take a day off. But in the US, the heroic worker ideal is no, pop the Sudafed pills, take the cold and flu max strength formulation. And if you read the side effect, like the little instructions there, it says don't drink coffee as well because Sudafed and caffeine interact in a potentially explosive way. I think there's something to this, and you could take this back to the early modern period when coffee makes its breakthrough, right? Because one of the increasingly important theories of the divergence between the West and the rest is not so much the Industrial Revolution, which really kicks off in the 18th and early 19th centuries, but the Industrious Revolution, which is a reallocation of time, essentially, and an increasing focus by Northwest Europeans on shifting the work-life balance trade-off, we call it now, and just simply working more hours, so as to pursue various types of consumption, which ironically included imported fancy goods from China. And you've got to ask yourself, what enables this? And rather than focusing on the stimulant effects of coffee, which are real, and tea, I think the real thing to focus on is the displacement effect. Because up to the early modern period and beyond, most Europeans, most of the time, were slightly or very drunk, because the safe thing to drink was not regular water, but various types of fermented alcohol, right? And this, it extends all the way down to drinking culture in Central Europe, where it's quite common to see, gangs of workers who are working on scaffolding. I remember seeing this in Germany, having a beer breakfast at 8:30 or 9 in the morning, and clearly working the day through in essentially hazardous conditions on scaffolding whilst slightly drunk. The rations of the German army in Bavaria include beer as a lunchtime drink. And that culture of just, mild inebriation to deal with all sorts of ailments at the time, including the pollution of the water, is displaced in the Industrial Revolution for at least some of the workforce by these new forms of consumption. They were marketed as such. They were marketed as reform consumption. They then overlap in the 19th century with various types of, sobriety moves, where alcohol is problematized as the demon drink that is going to destroy working class households through addiction. And gin in particular is, working its way through European society and British society in the early modern period. And of course, it's highly potent and addicting. So I think there's quite serious support for this as part of a story of the Industrious Revolution that then echoes down to this sort of drama of modern day devices for keeping us going when we shouldn't.
Yeah. makes me think of, one form of resistance is abstaining from coffee and maybe...
I'm not sure I go that far.
Yeah,
that's extraordinary. Yeah,
I mean,
kind of
drinking,
new wellness routines.
I'm not necessarily advocating for this, but it could be a form of resistance to start drinking during the day.
Oh, well, that is well established. Yeah. I mean, that's the Blue Monday. That was there's this fabulous E.P. Thompson essay, or maybe it's Eric Hobsbawm. I can't remember. One of those Marxist labor historians in Britain has this extraordinary essay about time control, right? And it was very common in European society for the work week actually to start on Tuesday, because everyone was just wrecked on Monday morning. Der blaue Montag, the phrase in German.
Yeah. Instead, we all line up at Starbucks instead. Yes, we will end this conversation here for now. See you all next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.